To understand Cleopatra, one must first understand the city that shaped her. Because Alexandria in the 1st century BC was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great at the western edge of the Nile Delta, it had been built from the ground up as a monument to ambition. Broad avenues, a harbor that could shelter the fleets of the known world, and at its intellectual center, a complex of buildings called the Mouseion, which housed the Great Library of Alexandria. This was not merely a repository of scrolls, but an active engine of human inquiry, where scholars like Euclid formalized the principles of geometry, and Aristophanes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, nearly 2 millennia before European navigators would attempt to verify it by sailing west. It was into this intensely intellectual environment that Cleopatra VII was born, most likely in early 69 BC, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, Pharaoh of Egypt. Her mother's identity remains one of history's genuinely frustrating ambiguities. The most probable candidate is Cleopatra V, a queen who appears in only a handful of fragmentary records before disappearing entirely from the historical evidence, possibly dying while her daughter was still very young. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was the latest in a long line of Macedonian Greek rulers who had governed Egypt since 305 BC, when Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most capable generals, had claimed Egypt in the political chaos that followed Alexander's sudden death at the age of 32. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty had maintained its grip on Egypt while remaining fundamentally Greek in language, culture, and self-conception, presiding over an Egyptian population through a carefully constructed dual identity that blended Hellenistic royal tradition with the imagery and ritual of ancient Egyptian kingship. What made Cleopatra VII genuinely different from her predecessors is a fact that rarely receives the attention it deserves. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn to speak Egyptian. Over nearly 3 centuries of ruling an Egyptian population, not one of the Macedonian kings or queens before her had bothered to acquire the language of the people they governed. They administered through translators, communicating through intermediaries, and participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies whose meanings they accessed only at a remove. Cleopatra changed this entirely. She was conversant not only in Greek and Egyptian, but also in Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and several other regional languages. This linguistic range was not merely an intellectual achievement, but a statement of political intent, signaling a relationship with Egypt and its people that was qualitatively different from anything the Ptolemaic dynasty had previously offered. Her childhood unfolded against a backdrop of growing external pressure on the dynasty's independence. The Ptolemaic kingdom had once been the most powerful of the successor states carved out of Alexander's empire, but by the time Cleopatra was born, the political geography of the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically. Rome had spent most of the previous 2 centuries consolidating control over the western Mediterranean, and had now turned its attention east, reorganizing the entire region according to its own interests. When Cleopatra was still a toddler, the Roman general Pompey the Great conducted a sweeping military campaign across the eastern Mediterranean, defeating the kingdom of Mithridates on the Black Sea coast, and then absorbing the remnants of the ancient Seleucid Empire into the new Roman province called Syria in 63 BC. Judea was reduced to a client state. Egypt, which had once presided over a regional empire stretching from the Nile Delta to the Levantine coast, was now the last major independent power of the eastern Mediterranean. A status that had less to do with Egyptian strength than with Roman hesitation about the costs of direct annexation. The hesitation was progressively giving way throughout Cleopatra's childhood. Within the Roman Senate, debates about annexing Egypt were conducted openly and repeatedly throughout the 60s BC. With the kingdom's extraordinary agricultural wealth and the commercial riches flowing through Alexandria from Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes making it an increasingly attractive prize. The political situation became acute when Rome stripped the island of Cyprus from Ptolemaic control around 58 BC, a move that destabilized Ptolemy XII's standing with his own court and eventually led to his removal from the throne by a court faction that placed his eldest daughter Bernice in his place. What happened next provided Cleopatra, then approximately 12 years old, with a formative education in the mechanics of power. Rather than accept his removal, Ptolemy XII chose to petition the Roman Senate directly for restoration to his throne, traveling to Rome and taking Cleopatra with him. They spent the better part of a year living at a villa owned by Pompey on the outskirts of the city, waiting for an audience before the Senate and working through whatever political alliance Ptolemy could assemble. The rival embassy sent by Bernice's government arrived in Rome to argue against his restoration, and its leader, the Alexandrian philosopher Dio, was subsequently poisoned in circumstances that strongly implicated Ptolemy's Roman allies. Cleopatra, observing all of this as a child in a foreign city, was watching a lesson in how Mediterranean power actually operated, through patronage, network, strategic alliances, the cultivation of influence backers, and a willingness to employ methods that bore no resemblance to formal political procedure. The intervention ultimately succeeded. Pompey arranged for his ally Aulus Gabinius, the Roman governor of Syria, to intervene militarily in Egypt on Ptolemy's behalf. By 55 BC, Bernice had been removed from the throne and executed. The court that had conspired against her father was purged, and Cleopatra found herself in a considerably stronger position as a loyal daughter who had accompanied her father through his years of exile. Among the Roman officers who participated in the military intervention was a young commander named Mark Antony, whose presence in Egypt at this moment would prove in retrospect to be the beginning of a connection that would eventually reshape the ancient world. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was approximately 18 years old, and she ascended to the throne under the weight of challenges that would have overwhelmed a less capable ruler. Following Ptolemaic custom, she could not govern alone, as a female ruler required a nominal male co-ruler to satisfy both Egyptian tradition and the expectations of Greek community that formed the backbone of Alexandrian political life. Her co-ruler was her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, a child of no more than 10 or 11 years old, and the two were married to one another in accordance with the dynasty's long-standing practice of sibling marriage. In practical terms, the real power was Cleopatra's, but the arrangement meant that the court factions surrounding her younger brother retained a foothold in Egyptian governance that would cause her serious difficulties before long. The material conditions of her early reign were equally demanding. The Ptolemaic dynasty was deeply in debt to Roman creditors who had bankrolled Ptolemy XII's restoration to power, and those debts required servicing in a kingdom whose agricultural foundations had been weakened by an unusually poor Nile inundation in the first months of her rule. The annual flooding of the Nile was not merely a natural phenomenon in ancient Egypt, but the fundamental mechanism of Egyptian civilization, depositing the rich alluvial soil that made the Nile Valley one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. When the inundation failed, food shortages followed with an inevitability that no administrative response could fully prevent. Compounding these difficulties was the presence of the Gabiniani, the roughly 2,000 Roman soldiers left behind from Gabinius' intervention, who had dug themselves into Egyptian political life and were increasingly expressing support for the young Ptolemy XIII and the court faction gathered around him. Cleopatra responded to these pressures by emphasizing the dimensions of her rule that set her apart from her predecessors. She traveled south to Thebes, the ancient religious capital of Pharaonic Egypt, to participate in the traditional ceremonies that formally invested her as a pharaoh. She aligned herself persistently with the cult of Isis, presenting herself in religious contexts not merely as a queen who patronized Egyptian religion, but as the goddess incarnate, the divine mother and the protector whose authority extended beyond the political. This identification was an act of considerable ideological sophistication. By casting herself as the earthly embodiment of the goddess, most deeply associated with the protection and the renewal of life, she was reaching for a form of legitimacy that transcended the dynasty's Greek origin and spoke directly to the Egyptian population in their own religious terms. The political situation deteriorated steadily through 50 and 49 BC. The court faction around Ptolemy XIII grew increasingly assertive, and evidence from royal inscriptions of the period suggests that Cleopatra attempted to consolidate sole rule before being checked and eventually forced to compromise. A de facto civil war between her supporters and those of her brother was developing, and when it became untenable for her to remain in Alexandria, she withdrew into the Levant to gather forces. She returned to find that events in the wider Roman world were about to introduce a new set of variables into her already complicated situation. The arrival of Pompey the Great on the Egyptian coast in late September of 48 BC was itself a consequence of events far beyond Egypt's borders. His decisive defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece had left him searching for a new base of operations from which to continue the civil war against Julius Caesar and Egypt, whose ruling dynasty owed him a significant debt of gratitude. It seemed like a natural destination. His calculation, however, proved fatally wrong. The court governing in Ptolemy XIII's name concluded that Caesar had won the decisive engagement, and that harboring his enemy was a risk the Ptolemaic court was unwilling to take. Pompey was murdered the moment he stepped ashore, his head preserved as evidence of the deed. Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later, and he was genuinely disturbed to receive the head of his defeated rival rather than the living man. He settled into the royal palace and began considering his position, which was more precarious than it might have appeared. He had arrived with only a small contingent of soldiers. The civil war against Pompey's remaining supporters was far from concluded, and he was now in the capital of a kingdom that was itself in the middle of its own dynastic conflict. Cleopatra, positioned outside Alexandria and unable to enter the city safely given her brother's control of it, recognized Caesar's arrival as an opportunity that might not present itself again. She arranged to be smuggled into the royal palace, with the most familiar account describing her concealed within a rolled carpet or linen sack, and presented herself directly to Caesar. She was 21 years old and he was 52. According to Cassius Dio and other ancient writers, Caesar was immediately captivated, and within a short time it was widely known that a personal relationship had developed between them alongside the political alliance. The political logic of the relationship was straightforward on both sides. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military support to resolve the civil war with her brother in her favor, and Caesar needed to stabilize Egypt quickly so that he could return to the wider conflict. Caesar declared Cleopatra queen and ordered the execution of Pothinus, the court eunuch who had been the principal power behind Ptolemy XIII. What followed was a remarkable sequence of events in which Caesar, having arrived in Alexandria with only a small force, found himself besieged inside the royal palace complex through the winter of 48 BC, as the forces of Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had her own political ambitions, pressed the siege. Roman reinforcements eventually arrived, and at the Battle of the Nile Delta in early 47 BC, the opposing forces were decisively defeated. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee, and Arsinoe was sent into religious exile at the Temple of Artemis in Iona, where the sanctity of the site made her untouchable for the time being. Cleopatra consolidated her recovered position by appointing her youngest brother as nominal co-ruler. Since Ptolemy XIV was approximately 11 years old and posed no real political threat, while maintaining the substantive power herself. She was also pregnant with Caesar's child, and this was a development whose significance extended well beyond Egypt. Caesar only had one child from a previous marriage, a daughter who had died in 54 BC. Then, in 47 BC, Cleopatra bore him a son. His name was Ptolemy Caesar, but known to history as Caesarion. Ptolemy Caesar was Caesar's only biological male heir. Roman law did not recognize children born outside of a Roman marriage as legitimate heirs, and the Roman political class was already deeply uneasy about Caesar's increasingly autocratic tendencies without the additional provocation of an Egyptian-born successor. Caesar left Egypt before the child was born, returning to the military and political affairs of the Roman world. He invited Cleopatra to Rome in 46 BC, and she spent nearly 2 years there with Caesarion. Her presence was not well received. Cicero, who knew her personally and wrote about her in his private letters with unconcealed hostility, reflected a broader anxiety about her influence over Caesar and what it represented for the Republic's future. Caesar had, by this point, claimed the title of dictator for life, and many in the Senate associated Cleopatra with this progressive abandonment of Republican tradition. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who had concluded that his rule was incompatible with the survival of the Republican government. Cleopatra left Rome promptly, having confirmed that Caesar's will had named his great-nephew Octavian as his heir rather than Caesarion. Back in Egypt, she removed Ptolemy XIV, whose death under unexplained circumstances was followed swiftly by the elevation of Caesarion as her co-ruler, and prepared for the next phase of a Roman civil war in which Egypt's resources and allegiances would inevitably become a deciding factor. Assassination of Caesar did not save the Roman Republic, but merely opened the next round of civil conflict. When the Liberators' War concluded with the defeat of Caesar's killer at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, three figures emerged as the dominant powers in the Roman world. Octavian, Caesar's young heir, had been barely 18 at the time of the assassination, but proved to possess political gifts that no one had initially anticipated. Marcus Lepidus was a reliable but ultimately marginal figure who would gradually be sidelined. Mark Antony, Caesar's most prominent ally and an experienced general, was widely regarded in the early 40s BC as the most likely eventual successor to Caesar's dominant position in Roman affairs. The alliance known as the Second Triumvirate divided the Roman world into spheres of influence, with Antony taking control of the eastern provinces, the wealthier and more commercially significant half of Rome's empire. This arrangement brought him directly into contact with Cleopatra, whose Egypt was the most important kingdom in his sphere and whose resources, fleet, and grain supply would be essential to any eastern military strategy he pursued. Their formal meeting took place in 41 BC at Tarsus in southern Turkey. Cleopatra arrived in a carefully orchestrated display of royal power, on a gilded barge with perfumed sails and dressed in the guise of Isis, in a deliberate effort to ensure that the encounter began on her terms rather than his. What developed between them over the following years combined genuine personal attachment with unmistakable political utility. Antony spent considerable time at Cleopatra's court in Alexandria, and the life they cultivated together was described by ancient writers in terms of extraordinary luxury, though much of that description was shaped by hostile Roman sources interested in portraying Antony as having surrendered to Eastern indulgence. They had 3 children together, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 BC, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus, born in 36 BC. Antony also married Octavian's sister in 40 BC as part of an effort to maintain his political alliance with his co-triumvirate. A marriage that produced 2 daughters before his continued relationship with Cleopatra made the arrangement untenable. The most famous story attached to their time together comes from Pliny the Elder's Encyclopedic Natural History. Written a century after the events, it describes and concerns a wager between Cleopatra and Antony over who could hold the more extravagant banquet. According to Pliny, Cleopatra won the bet by dissolving a priceless pearl earring in a cup of vinegar and drinking it. Whether or not the story is historically accurate, it reveals something important about how their court was perceived in Rome. It was a place of deliberate excess where normal standards of Roman conduct were being set aside in favor of something that struck Roman observers as transgressive and foreign. Octavian in Rome understood the propaganda value of this perception and worked persistently to amplify it. The donations of Alexandria and the road to war. The event that most conclusively shifted the political balance against Antony and Cleopatra came in 34 BC. Following a successful Roman military campaign in Armenia, Antony, returning to Alexandria with the captured Armenian king as his prisoner, chose to celebrate his victory not in Rome, where the traditional triumph would have been held, but in Alexandria, in Cleopatra's capital. The ceremony itself might have been manageable as a political provocation, but what followed on the evening of the triumph was far more significant. In an event known as the Donations of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony presided over a formal declaration in which they distributed lavish royal titles to their children in a manner that amounted to a public declaration of independence from the Roman political framework. Caesarion was proclaimed co-king of Egypt and declared to be the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian, whose entire claim to power rested on his status as Caesar's adopted heir. Their son, Alexander Helios, was named king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, including territories that Rome had not yet conquered. Their daughter, Cleopatra Selene, was given the title of Queen of Cerincia, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria. The ceremony was in essence a declaration that Cleopatra and Antony were constructing a parallel empire in the East governed by their children and operating outside the structures of Roman Republican authority. Octavian's response was methodical and strategically patient. He had acquired a copy of Antony's will, reportedly deposited at the Temple of Vesta in Rome, which included a wish to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, a provision that confirmed for Roman audiences that Antony had effectively abandoned his Roman identity. Rather than declare war on his fellow Roman co-triumvir, Octavian directed Roman declaration of war specifically at Cleopatra and Egypt, framing the coming conflict not as civil war, but as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen with ambitions to rule the empire from the east. The rhetorical maneuver was effective, though a substantial number of senators left Rome to join Antony's camp in Greece, indicating that the political situation remained genuinely contested. The war was decided at the Battle of Actium, fought on the 2nd of September, 31 BC. At the mouth of the Gulf of Corinth, off the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra and Antony had assembled a large fleet and land army in Greece. But the campaign had gone poorly from the outset. Disease had weakened their forces, and Octavian's admiral, Marcus Agrippa, had demonstrated a mastery of naval tactics that systematically undermined their strategic position. On the day of the battle, Antony and Cleopatra attempted to break out of the Gulf and force a decisive engagement on the open sea. But their larger vessels were outmaneuvered by Octavian's more agile galleys, and their formation broke apart under pressure. Cleopatra withdrew with her squadron towards Egypt, and Antony followed. Their land armies, stranded on the Greek coast after the fleet's departure, largely surrendered in the days that followed. Despite having the better part of a year to prepare for the invasion of Egypt, the ability to recover from Actium proved beyond them. When Octavian arrived in Egypt in the summer of 30 BC, the resistance his forces encountered was minimal. A final engagement outside of Alexandria in July saw Antony's troops offer only token opposition. Antony, having received a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, took his own life and died shortly afterward. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's forces and brought before him, where she was told that her life would be spared. Understanding what the assurance meant required no great insight from a woman who had spent 20 years navigating Roman power politics. A living Cleopatra was, from Octavian's perspective, a trophy intended for his eventual triumphal procession through Rome. The visible proof of his victory over the last independent power in the eastern Mediterranean. She had observed Roman political culture closely enough to understand precisely what the experience entailed, and she was not prepared to accept it now that the moment had finally arrived. She arranged her own death with what the ancient sources described as a deliberate, almost ceremonial composure, eating a final meal and preparing herself carefully before dying. The most probable cause was a prepared poison, though the most famous account of death by asp bite from a snake smuggled in a basket of figs has persisted as the dominant version of the story. Some historians have raised the possibility that Octavian had her quietly murdered, and the snake story was a convenient fiction, a suspicion plausible enough that it cannot be dismissed, though it cannot be proven either. She died around the 10th of August, 30 BC, at approximately 39 years of age. Cleopatra's death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the end of Egyptian independence, and the beginning of a new political order in the Mediterranean world. Octavian had Caesarion executed shortly afterward, since the boy was 17 and represented the only figure who could claim direct biological descent from Julius Caesar, making him an unacceptable rival. Cleopatra's children with Antony were spared and sent to Rome to be raised in the household of Octavia, the woman Antony had humiliated through his continued relationship with Cleopatra. The daughter, Cleopatra Selene, eventually married King Yuba II of Mauritania and lived out her years as queen of a North African kingdom. The mausoleum in which Cleopatra and Antony were buried somewhere in or near Alexandria has never been found, and it is likely submerged beneath the harbor waters by the coastal subsidence that gradually swallowed much of the ancient city. Egypt became a Roman province under Octavian's direct personal control, administered with an unusual degree of imperial attention that reflected how clearly he understood its strategic and economic importance. Alexandria itself continued to flourish as the second city of the empire and the intellectual capital of the Greek East. The commercial networks Cleopatra had cultivated through Egypt's Red Sea ports, connecting Rome to the trade routes of Arabia, India, and East Africa, expanded dramatically under Roman administration and generated wealth that enriched the empire for centuries. Cleopatra's presence in the historical record is remarkably persistent. She appears in the writings of more than 50 ancient authors, discussed by historians, encyclopedists, and poets, across the full span of the Roman imperial period. A frequency of mention that reflects how deeply her life intersected with the central events of the late Republican and early imperial age. The transition from Roman Republic to the Roman Empire was one of the defining political transformations in the history of Western civilization, and Cleopatra was not peripheral to that transformation. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony, the political choices she made, and the war she ultimately lost were among the forces that shaped its outcome. What her life ultimately represents is the story of a ruler of considerable intelligence and political skill operating within constraints she could not have removed, managing an extraordinarily difficult situation with more success and for longer than any reasonable assessment of her starting position would have predicted. She came to power at 18 over a kingdom that had been losing ground to Rome for a century before she was born, carrying debts her father had accumulated and navigating a court full of people who wanted her removed. She held her ground for 20 years and maintained Egypt's independence through the most turbulent period in Roman political history. The question of whether her relationships with Caesar and Antony were driven primarily by personal feeling or political calculation is one that ancient sources themselves were unable to resolve. And the honest answer is that the distinction may not have been as meaningful to her as it is to historians applying modern frameworks to an ancient life. She operated in a world where personal relationships and political necessity were deeply interwoven, where the boundary between love and alliance was routinely indistinct, and where the survival of a kingdom depended on the cultivation of exactly the kind of personal loyalties that her relationship with the two most powerful Romans of her age provided. Her name has endured for 2,000 years because her life was genuinely consequential, because she appears at the turning point of a transformation that reshaped the ancient world, and because the questions her story raises about power, ambition, and the limits of what any individual can accomplish against the forces of history remain as compelling now as they were to the ancient writers who first committed them to record.